She fed 9 children from one loaf in a shack. A farmer said, "Pack everything." The bread wasn't enough. I could see that from 50 yards. I wasn't trying to see it. I was coming down off the Cutter Ridge Trail on my way back from Harlan Mott's place, where I'd gone to settle a fence dispute that turned out to be nothing. Harlan's youngest had pulled 3 stakes to use as throwing sticks, and neither man had known it. And I came around the south bend of the creek road, and there she was on the step of the Delacroft shack, the one they used to call the Widow Delacroft's before she died and her daughter-in-law took it. And that woman was tearing a single loaf of bread into pieces the size of a thumb joint, counting under her breath, the children arranged in front of her in a rough line like they'd done this before and knew the drill. 9 of them. The youngest was maybe 2 years old, sitting in the dust with its fist in its mouth. The oldest was a girl of about 13 who was holding a baby on her hip while she waited her turn. The bread was gone before the line was done. I watched the woman look at her empty hands and then look at the last 2 children still waiting, and I saw her jaw move, but I couldn't hear what she said from where I sat on the horse. I sat there a minute. My horse, a brown quarter-horse mare I'd called Patience because she had none, shifted under me and snorted. I turned her around and rode back to my place. My name is Clarence Aldous Prout, and I have been farming the bottomland north of Cutter Creek since 1867. I am not a man of many words. My wife Ida died in the winter of 1878, and I have run the place alone since then, with seasonal help when I can get it, and I have had no cause to involve myself in the affairs of other people, except when the occasion made it impossible not to. I was 51 years old that summer, and my back had begun to give me trouble in the mornings, and I could feel the land changing under me, drier each year, the creek running lower, the good years getting thinner, and I had enough of my own worry without taking on anybody else's. That is the honest truth. I am telling you this so you understand what I rode away from that bend in the road and what I turned back toward. I got to my place and put Patience in the barn and stood in my kitchen for about 10 minutes. I had half a smoked ham hanging in the cold room, wrapped in cheesecloth. I had a 10-pound sack of cornmeal, mostly full. I had dried beans, 2 big crocks of them, pinto and navy. I had salt pork. I had 3 dozen eggs from that morning that I was going to take to Bledsoe's store on Thursday. I had onions braided and hanging. I had 2 pumpkins from last fall I hadn't gotten to yet, starting to go soft on one side. I thought about the smallest child sitting in the dirt with its fist in its mouth. I got the big flat-bottomed wagon, not the light one. I backed it up to the cold room and loaded it. Ham, cornmeal, 1 crock of beans. I left the other one because I am not a fool and I had my own winter to think about. 8 eggs, salt pork, 4 onions. I left the pumpkins. They wouldn't travel well and I'd bring them separately if it came to that. I threw in a wool blanket I had in the barn, because when I'd passed the shack I'd noticed there was no smoke from the chimney, and it was already late August and the nights were cooling. I drove back out to Cutter Creek Road. Now let me tell you about Nora Greer, because this story isn't worth a damn without her. She had come to the Delacroft shack 8 months before, in the dead of winter, with the 9 children and a husband named Cobb Greer, who lasted about 6 weeks before he rode to Bledsoe's for tobacco and kept on going east, and nobody saw him again. She was 34 years old. She was thin in the way that people get thin when they have been working past their strength for too long, the kind of thin where you can see the shape of the effort in a person's face. But her eyes were clear. They were the color of creek water in October, that gray-green, and they missed nothing. She had a way of standing that was very still and very straight even when she was clearly worn to the bone, and I had seen that way of standing before in men who had been through something bad and come out the other side still on their feet. The 9 children were hers by blood, not some blended household or charity case. She'd had them in the span of 12 years, which tells you something about what her marriage had been and also something about her own constitution. The oldest girl, Mabel, had taken on the care of the youngest two without anyone apparently having to tell her to. The boys, there were 5 of them ranging from 4 to 11, had a look of being contained, the way boys get when they have learned early that noise makes things worse. I did not know all of this when I pulled the wagon up to the shack that afternoon. I knew her name and that her husband had gone. The rest I learned over time. She was in the side yard splitting wood when I came around, which surprised me because I hadn't thought there would be anything left to split. She stopped and held the axe at her side and looked at me in the wagon without saying anything. The children came out from around the back of the house and stopped behind her. I said, "I'm Clarence Prude. I farm the bottomland on the North Fork." She said, "I know who you are." I said, "I've got some things in the wagon here that I can't use before they go off." It was not exactly a lie. The ham would have kept another 3 weeks easy, but it wasn't a lie I was ashamed of either. She looked at the wagon. She looked at me. Her jaw did the same thing I'd seen it do from the road, that small, held motion, like she was working something out behind her teeth that she wasn't going to say out loud. She said, "I don't take charity." I said, "It's not charity. It's a neighbor not wanting to see food wasted." She said, "That's what charity calls itself when it wants to be accepted." I said, "Fair point." We stood there. The wind moved through the cottonwood along the creek. One of the boys, the middle-sized one, maybe 8 or 9, had come around to my side of the wagon and was looking at the ham with an expression that no child should have to wear, that particular mix of want and the discipline of not wanting out loud. I said, "Ma'am, I don't know how to make this not be what it is, but I'd take it as a personal favor if you'd let me unload." She held my eyes for another moment. Then she turned to Mabel and said something low that I didn't catch, and Mabel took the 2 youngest inside. She said, "You can unload." I unloaded. The boy who'd been looking at the ham carried the cornmeal sack without being asked, and I let him do it without comment. Nora Greer directed where things went in the cold room with the same economy she seemed to apply to everything. No extra words, no gesture that wasn't necessary. When it was done, she turned and looked at the wagon and said, "The blanket too." I said, "If you need it." She nodded. I handed it down. She folded it over one arm and stood holding it and said, "I'll repay this." I said, "No need." She said, "I will repay it." I got back up on the wagon. I drove home. I thought about that jaw, the way she'd held the axe, the way she'd said, "I will repay it," not as a social grace, not as a polite noise people make. She meant it the way you mean a thing when you've had to hold on to your own word to yourself through the kind of winters that would have let most people off the hook. That was the first time. The second time was 3 days later, and it wasn't me who went to her. She came to me. I was in the lower field digging out a clogged irrigation run when I heard someone crossing the fence line and looked up, and it was the boy, the one who'd carried the cornmeal. He was walking fast with a cloth-wrapped bundle under his arm, and he came up to me and held it out and said, "My mother sent this." I unwrapped it, 6 cornbread pieces baked flat on a skillet, still warm. I said, "Tell her thank you." He said, "She said to tell you she'll have more when she can manage it." I looked at him. He was a straight-standing boy with her eyes and her way of holding himself. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Ellis." I said, "Ellis, I've got a fence post that needs driving, and I could use an extra hand if you're not busy." He looked at me a moment, checking, I think, whether I was doing the thing where you offer a child a task so he doesn't feel like a charity case, and whether I was doing it badly enough to be insulting. Whatever he decided, he set down the cloth the cornbread had been in and folded it careful and put it in his pocket and said, "All right." We drove the post. He was a good worker. He didn't talk much, which suited me. When he left, I ate 2 pieces of the cornbread standing in the field. It was better than anything I'd made myself in years. She'd done something with the fat. I couldn't tell if it was the proportion or the timing, but it had a texture that my own came out missing. I ate it and looked out at the lower field and thought about a woman who couldn't feed her children and still sent back a gift made from the flour I'd given her, because her word was her word. I did not know yet what I was going to do. Or rather, I knew, and I was arguing with myself about it the way a man does when he already knows the argument is settled. Let me tell you about the land situation. The Delacroft shack sat on 40 acres of the creek bottom that the original Delacroft had homesteaded in 1861. He died young. His widow had worked it another 15 years before she died, and it had passed to her son, who had been Cobb Greer's brother-in-law or some such arrangement. And Cobb had come into it by marriage or debt or some paperwork I didn't know the details of. The land itself was decent. Better than decent. It had good water access from the creek, and the soil in the southern quarter was the dark kind that held moisture. Cobb Greer hadn't done anything with it except let the fences go and dig a cellar he never finished. The shack was in poor repair. The chimney had a crack in the firebox mortar that I could see from the road. One wall of the small barn was leaning. I knew all of this because I knew this creek bottom and everything on it. I had spent 30 years reading this land the way you read a book you know well, knowing where every page turns, where the water went in a wet spring and where it went short in a dry one. The Delacroft 40 was a good parcel. In the hands of someone who knew what to do with it, it could carry a family. Not a large family and not in comfort, but carry them, keep them fed, keep them above the line. In the hands of a woman alone with 9 children and no tools and no cash and a cracked firebox chimney and a winter coming, it would not carry anyone. I drove over again on a Saturday. I told myself I was going to look at the chimney. Nora Greer was in the garden when I came, on her knees in the dirt turning compost in between the vegetable rows, and she heard the wagon and stood without hurrying and came to the gate. I told her about the chimney. She said she was aware of it. I said if the crack spread it would be a fire risk when she started heating the place for winter. She said she knew that too. I said I've done some mortar work, I could look at it. She said, I won't have you working on my property for nothing, Mr. Prout. I said you could pay me in cornbread. She looked at me a long moment and I couldn't tell what she was thinking behind those creekwater eyes. Then she said, there's worse arrangements. I looked at the chimney. It was fixable, not easy, but fixable. The crack ran maybe 14 inches up the firebox face, and there was some spalling in the upper flue that needed pointing. I spent the afternoon on it. 2 of the boys helped me mix the mortar. I think she sent them to keep an eye on what I was doing, which I respected, and Mabel brought me water twice and stood watching with the particular watchfulness of a 13-year-old who has been functioning as a second adult and is trying to determine whether I was the kind of person who added to the weight or subtracted from it. Nora came out at 4 o'clock with a tin cup of coffee and set it on the porch rail and went back inside without saying anything. The coffee was strong. She'd used the grounds twice, maybe 3 times, but she'd made it strong on purpose, which told me she paid attention to how people took their coffee, or she'd guessed right. I finished the firebox that afternoon and told her I'd need to come back to do the upper flue. I'd need to be on the roof and I hadn't brought the right tools. She said all right. I came back on Tuesday. I did the flue. She sent Ellis out with a plate of food at noon, beans and a piece of cornbread and some dried apple, and he sat on the ground near the barn and we ate together in a companionable quiet and then went back to what we were doing. The chimney took 2 visits. The leaning barn wall took 1 more. The cellar Cobb had started but not finished took 4 Saturdays spread across September, with Ellis working alongside me most days and sometimes the next boy up, the 10-year-old named Warren, who was quieter even than Ellis and worked with a kind of focused intensity that was going to make him formidable when he got his growth. I want to be careful here about what I'm telling you and what I'm not. This was not a courtship, not in September. It was 2 people in adjacent difficulty, mine of a different kind than hers, lighter than hers, but I had my own, working out a practical arrangement that suited both. She fed me when I worked on her property. I did the work that needed doing. We did not discuss anything beyond the immediate task. She did not ask me about my wife or my life, and I did not ask her about hers. But I noticed things. I noticed that she woke before her children, which meant she woke before first light, because I arrived once at an early hour. The barn wall was loose enough I was worried about it in a wind, and she was already in the yard with a lamp, looking at the wall, assessing it the way I would have. I noticed that she had a system for everything, for the children's chores, for the food rationing, for the firewood, for which child needed what kind of managing. The older boys responded to plain instruction. The youngest two needed something softer, and she gave it to them without seeming to shift gears, the way good horsemen move with a horse without you seeing the signals. I noticed that she did not complain. Not once in all those weeks. She named problems plainly when they were relevant. The east wall is soft. The well rope is fraying. I think the root cellar is going to flood, but she named them as facts, not as grievances. There was no self-pity in her, which is rarer than it sounds. Most people, given her situation, would have found self-pity not only understandable but practically mandatory. She refused it. Not with any visible effort. It simply didn't seem to be in her vocabulary. I noticed, one afternoon in late September, that she was favoring her left hand, wrapping it when she thought no one was looking, flexing it in a way that meant pain. When I asked, she said she'd taken a blister from the axe handle that had gone bad. I asked to see it and she showed me. It was infected, swollen and hot at the base of 2 fingers. I told her she needed to soak it in hot salt water and keep it wrapped, and that she could not swing an axe for at least a week or she'd make it worse. She said, "I need the wood." I said, "I'll cut it." She opened her mouth and I said, "I know, not charity. You can send Ellis with cornbread on Friday." She closed her mouth. Something moved in her face that I didn't try to name. She said, "All right." I split 4 days of wood that afternoon. Ellis came on Friday with the cornbread, and also, this was not asked for, a jar of wild plum preserves that Nora had put up from some trees along the east fence, and a note in handwriting that was careful and neat. "Thank you for the wood. The plums were a good year, N. Greer." I put the note in my chest of drawers, and I am not going to explain why. October came in cold. The first hard frost hit the 14th, and I went over the morning after to see how the garden had fared and found Nora already in it, assessing the damage, the children around her. The squash had made it mostly. Some of the late beans. The turnips were fine. Frost doesn't hurt a turnip. The tomatoes were gone, but they'd had their run. She was tallying it with the same quiet efficiency, moving down the rows, her breath clouding in the cold air. I stood at the fence and watched, and she looked up and said, "The cellar will hold what we've got. It'll be close." I said, "How close?" She said, "February is the question." February is always the question in this country. It's the month when whatever you put up in the fall either turns out to have been enough or it doesn't, and you find out which around the time when there's nothing you can do about it. I said, "I've got a second crock of beans." She said, "Mr. Pruitt." I said, "Nora." It was the first time I'd used her given name. It came out without planning it, and I won't say I was sorry, because I wasn't. She stopped. She was still holding a handful of frost-killed bean vines. She looked at me for a moment, and the frost air was between us, and Warren was watching from down the row. She said, quieter, "I don't want to be a burden to you." I said, "You're not." She said, "I have 9 children, Mr. Pruitt." I said, "I know that." She said, "That's not a small thing." I said, "I'm aware of the arithmetic." She looked at me, and I looked at her, and the frost-killed vines hung from her hand, and the cold was coming down off the ridge in a way that meant real weather before nightfall. I said, "I've been thinking about the 40 acres. She waited. I said, "Your south quarter, the dark soil patch down by the second bend. I've been thinking it wants to be in winter wheat. I've got seed. I could put it in this week if the ground's not froze yet. She said, that's my land. I said, I know it's your land. She said, you'd be doing the work. I said, we'd split the yield, 60 you 40 me. The land is yours and I'm providing seed and labor, so we split it that way. She looked at me a long time. I am not a man who talks much, and I had said a lot for me, and I felt it. The cold was settling in the garden around us, and the children were still, watching, in the way children watch when something important is happening that they don't fully understand. She said, you don't have to do this. I said, I know it. She said, you've already done more than. I said, Nora, let me put in the wheat. Another silence. The frost was hard on the dead vines. Somewhere behind the shack, one of the youngest ones had started making a sound that was about to turn into crying, and Mabel went to it without being asked. She said, 60-40. I said, done. She nodded. She dropped the dead vines on the row and straightened up and looked at the field and then at me and said, you should come in for coffee before you freeze. I came in. It was the first time I had been inside the shack. It was clean, impressively clean, given 9 children and minimal resources, and she had put curtains up at the windows that were made from sacking, but dyed some way that made them look almost nice. The children distributed themselves around the room in their particular arrangements, and Mabel poured coffee, without being asked, and Ellis brought me a 3-legged stool from the corner, because there wasn't enough seating for a visitor. I drank the coffee. It was good. She'd used fresh grounds. I put in the winter wheat that week. Ellis helped me every day after his other work, and Warren came on Saturday. The dark soil was everything I'd thought it was, easy to work, holding moisture at the right level, and it took the seed like it wanted to. We got it all in before the second freeze. November. I am going to be straight with you about November because it was the month that changed the shape of things, though I would not have said so at the time. A man named Dolph Sutter came to the Delacroft shack on the 3rd Tuesday of that month. I did not see it happen. I heard about it afterward from Ellis, who told me with a control in his voice that was remarkable for a boy his age. Sutter was Cobb Greer's cousin or second cousin, out of the same Eastern Territory, and he had a paper, or claimed to have a paper, that said the 40 acres reverted to a Greer male heir in the event that Cobb Greer abandoned or vacated the property. He stood at the door of the shack and told Nora she had until the 1st of March to be off the land, or he would have the county sheriff remove her and the children. Nora had told him to get off her step. He had told her she didn't have a step to speak of any more. She had gone inside and shut the door. She had not cried. Ellis told me this with the particular pride a boy has when his mother does the unthinkable thing calmly. I drove over the next morning. I found her at the table with a piece of paper in front of her that she had been writing on, a letter, it looked like, to someone official. She was very still when I came in, and she told me about Sutter without preamble, the same way she reported on a wall that was going soft. Here is the problem, here are the dimensions of it. She said, I don't know if his paper is genuine. Cobb might have signed something. He signed things without telling me. I said, what's the name of the county seat lawyer you filed the original homestead registration through? She said, I didn't. That was Cobb's territory. I said, who witnessed it? She said, I don't know. I sat down across from her at the table. I said, give me a few days. She said, this isn't your problem, Clarence. She was using my name more easily by then, when she wasn't being careful. I said, let me look at it. I drove to the county seat the next day. I know a man there named Preston Wade who has been the county recorder for 20 years and knows where every piece of paper in the territory has been filed, and when and by whom. I bought Preston lunch at the hotel dining room and told him what I was looking for. He went to his office and came back in an hour and a half with the information I needed. The Delacroft 40 was homesteaded under the original Delacroft registration, transferred to his widow, transferred again to the estate of the widow, which had been administered by her nephew, a man named Carl Delacroft from over near Gallup, who had signed it over to Cobb Greer in payment of a debt. The transfer was clean and recorded, and Cobb's name was on it. What was also on it in the second page of the agreement was the stipulation that the property passed to Cobb's lawful heirs upon his death or permanent departure, and the lawful heirs were defined as wife and children, in that order, not collateral male relatives. Dolph Sutter's paper, whatever it was worth less than the paper it was written on. I got that in writing from Preston, who charged me $3 for his time and the certified copy, which I thought was fair. I drove back and gave Nora the certified copy. I explained what it said. She read it twice and then set it down on the table flat and put both hands on it, the way you put your hands on something solid when you need to feel solid. She said, "You didn't need to." I said, "Dolph Sutter's going to hear about this from someone with a loud enough voice that he won't be back. I know a few people who can serve that purpose." She said, "I can fight my own battles." I said, "I know you can. You can also let me fight one." She looked at me. Something moved in her face that I was starting to recognize. That thing she did when she was letting someone in a little further than she'd intended. She said, "Did you eat before you drove back?" I said, "No." She got up and fed me. Salt pork and beans and the last of the cornbread from that morning, reheated on the stove. She sat across from me while I ate and we didn't talk much, and outside the window the November sky was the color of pewter, and inside the shack it was warm from the firebox I'd fixed in September, and the children came in from their various places and distributed themselves, and it was, I thought, the most comfortable I'd felt in a room since Ida died. I had the conversation with Sutter through a mutual acquaintance, a man named Aldridge who ran cattle in the area and had no patience for paper games. I won't give you the details because they're not flattering to either party, but Sutter did not come back to the Delacroft property. The third week of November, Nora got sick. I had a habit by then of coming by every few days, sometimes with a reason and sometimes manufacturing one. Ellis met me at the gate that Thursday with a look on his face that was managing something harder than he was letting it show. He said, "My mother's unwell." I asked what kind of unwell. He said she had fever and a cough and she was in bed, which he said in a tone that communicated the full gravity of it, that she was the kind of person who didn't go to bed, who worked through sick the same way she worked through everything else, and her being in bed meant it was bad enough to have forced her there. I asked if they were all right for food. He said yes. I asked if Mabel had the young ones. He said yes. He was doing what she did, naming the facts, keeping his voice level. I drove to Bledsoe's and bought quinine and willow bark, and the brown chest medicine that old Doc Hartwell recommended, and came back. Mabel let me in. The shack was quieter than I'd ever heard it, 9 children quieter by some agreed-upon understanding that the situation required it. Nora was on her cot in the back corner, curtained off by a hanging cloth. She was asleep when I came in, or I thought she was. Mabel showed me where to put the medicine, and I set it on the small crate beside the cot. Nora opened her eyes. They were 2 bright fever eyes, but they found me right away, which told me she wasn't as far gone as the brightness suggested. She said, "You didn't need to come." I said, "Take the quinine tonight. Mabel knows how to make the willow bark tea." She said, "I know how." I said, "Yes, you know everything, take the quinine." Something at the corner of her mouth shifted. She said, "I feel terrible." I said, "I know." She said, "The woodpile." I said, "I'll look at it." She said, "The little ones are." I said, "Nora, I've got it." She looked at me for a long moment with those bright fever eyes, and then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "I hate needing help." I said, most people worth anything do. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Clarence. I said, yes. She said, thank you for coming. I said, sleep. I looked at the woodpile. It was getting low, and I split enough to last 4 days. I checked the firebox I'd mortared in September. It was drawing clean and the heat was good. I made sure the 2 youngest had their blanket, which meant going into the children's corner where they were stacked in various arrangements in 2 small beds, and the youngest, the 2-year-old, was sitting up and looking at me with enormous calm eyes, and I sat on the edge of his bed for a while in the warm and did not think about anything in particular. I came back every day for a week. The second day she was still badly off, but she drank the willow bark tea without argument, which told me the fever had got her low enough to accept help, and I took no satisfaction in that, only did what needed doing and left. Third day she was sitting up. Fourth, she was at the table for the noon meal, pale and moved carefully but upright and directing traffic in the shack with the same system she always used, only quieter. The 5th day she said to me, "You've been here every day." I said, "Yes." She said, "You have your own farm." I said, "It'll keep." She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "I don't know what to do with that." I said, "You don't have to do anything with it." She looked up at me. We were at the table and she was still pale, and Mabel was in the next room keeping the young ones occupied, and the fire was going well, and it was quiet. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Because I want to." She said, "That's not a sufficient answer." I said, "It's the only one I've got right now." She held my eyes for a while. Then she nodded once and went back to her coffee, and I went back to mine, and neither of us said anything else about it. She was well by the following week. Back to herself, which meant back to the axe and the chickens and the organizing of the children before I could argue with her about it. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not announced, just the smallest adjustment, the way a door that has been stuck for a long time will suddenly move easy in its frame. December. The wheat was up. Green rose in the south field, coming along the way good wheat does in the right soil with enough moisture going in, and I stood at the fence line looking at it on a cold December morning, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was satisfaction that wasn't entirely about the wheat. I had taken to eating supper at the shack most Saturdays. There wasn't a formal arrangement. It had accumulated, the way things do when 2 people keep showing up and neither one calls a halt to it. Nora cooked. I ate. We talked not much and not about large things, mostly about what needed doing and what had been done and the occasional observation about the weather or the land. But I noticed over those weeks the shape of her mind. The way she thought through problems was methodical and unsentimental, and she saw angles I sometimes missed. And when I described something I was working on, she listened without interrupting, and then asked one question that was usually the right question. The children had stopped treating me like a visitor. Ellis would show me things, a rock he'd found, a snare he was learning to set, with the casual ease of a boy showing something to someone who would understand it. The youngest ones climbed on things near me without being told not to. Mabel, who had her mother's way of measuring people carefully before deciding about them, had started smiling when I came in, which I took as a significant endorsement. On the 2nd Saturday of December, I was sitting at the table after supper and the younger children were being got ready for bed, and Ellis was working something out in a school primer at the far end of the table, and Nora sat across from me with her hands around a coffee cup, and it was just like that, nothing dramatic, no particular occasion, and I thought, this is what I want. This table, this woman across from it, these 9 children being loud in the next room. This. I thought it plainly, like a fact, like a measurement. I was quiet about it for a while. I am not a hasty man. Christmas came. I brought a smoked venison haunch I'd been given in trade by a man over near Ridgeline, and pine boughs I'd cut on the ridge because there was nothing else for decoration, and I thought the children ought to have something. Nora made a pie from the dried apples she'd been hoarding, and the 9 children were, for one afternoon, entirely ordinary children at Christmas, which is to say loud and difficult and full of an energy that was purely joy. And I sat in the corner with a cup of coffee and watched Nora watch them, and her face was, I am not going to try to describe her face. I'm just going to tell you that I saw her. All of her. The worn and the held and the still going and the love for those children that was so large it had shaped the whole architecture of her life. And I thought, there it is. That's what good looks like. January. I had a conversation with myself, out in the barn, on a night so cold the water in the bucket had a skin of ice by morning. I'll tell you how it went. On one side, I was 51 years old. I was not wealthy, the bottomland was good and the farm was sound, but I had no savings to speak of and a mortgage that still had 12 years on it. I had a quiet life built for one person, and it ran smoothly because it was built for one person and 9 children, and a strong-willed woman would change every corner of it. I did not know if Nora Greer had feelings for me beyond gratitude and practical regard. A woman in her situation might mistake gratitude for something else, and it would be wrong of me to take advantage of the weight of obligation she felt. These were real considerations. I did not dismiss them. On the other side, the Southfield winter wheat was going to come in, and it was going to be a good yield, and I knew things about that creek bottom that I hadn't had anyone to know them with me in 7 years, and I was tired of eating alone, and Nora Greer had a mind that matched mine in the way that you don't find by looking for it, and you know it when it shows up. There was a third thing, which I will tell you only because I am old enough now not to be ashamed of it. I had been useful again. Not to a field or a fence line or an irrigation ditch, but to people, actual people, 9 children and their mother, in a way that had made a concrete difference to whether they were all right or not. I had not known how much I had missed that. A man can work his land alone for years and be fine, and I had been fine. But there is a different thing from fine that you don't notice you're missing until it comes back. And it had come back all through that fall in the form of a lean woman who didn't take charity, and a boy named Ellis who carried a cornmeal sack without being asked. I was not willing to let it go again. I thought about Ida while I stood there. That is worth saying. I had loved Ida well, and she had loved me, and her absence was still a room in the house that I didn't go into very often but knew was there. I did not think asking Nora would be a betrayal of Ida. Ida had been a practical woman with a clear-eyed view of what life was and what a person needed in it. I think she would have looked at Nora Greer and approved, in the quiet, definite way she had approved of things. I think she would have approved of the cornbread, particularly. I also thought about what kind of man I was going to be at 51. I had built the North Farm from rough bottomland starting at 24 years old. I had dug the irrigation runs myself in the first year, broken the lower field with a plow that kept throwing its blade, fixed the barn twice when weather took pieces of it, and kept the whole enterprise running through the dry years of the early 80s when half the creek bottom farmers gave up and left. I was not a man who gave up when something was hard. I was not a man who looked at a thing that was difficult and decided it was someone else's problem. 9 children was a difficulty. It was also 9 people who needed someone in their corner, and I had been in their corner since August without deciding to be, and it had felt more natural than anything I had done alone in 7 years. That was the whole argument. I stood in the cold barn with my breath making clouds and listened to both sides, and then I went back in the house and went to bed. February. The question. I went over on a gray Tuesday morning. The wheat in the south field was holding, I'd checked it on the way, and the creek was frozen at the edges but running in the middle, which meant the water table was all right. The sky was the color of an old nickel. She was in the side yard with Ellis and Warren, the 3 of them working on the woodpile with a systematic efficiency that I recognized as her method of making a job that is bigger than you into a series of jobs that are the right size. I came through the gate and she looked up and her expression was what it always was, still, considering. A degree of warmth that she kept behind the stillness, but that I knew how to read now. I said, "Can I talk to you?" Ellis and Warren exchanged a look that told me they were not as oblivious as they perhaps appeared. Ellis said he thought he'd heard something in the barn, and Warren agreed, and they found reasons to be somewhere else. She waited. I said, "I want to say something and I want to say it plainly because I don't know another way." She said, "All right." I said, "I've been coming over here since August and I told myself it was practical and it was, but it isn't only that. You know it isn't only that." She was still. The nickel-colored sky was behind her, and her breath clouded in the cold, and she held the hatchet at her side. I said, "I'm not a young man and I don't have a great deal to offer beyond a sound farm and a willingness to work, and the fact that I am here and I intend to keep being here. I know what I'm asking, and I'm not asking it lightly." She said, "What are you asking?" I said, "I'm asking if you'd be my wife." The cold was between us. Somewhere inside the shack, one of the youngest children was making the sound they made just before crying. The creek was running in the middle under its ice. She said, "You've thought about this?" I said, "Since November." Something shifted in her face. Not the smile shape, something deeper than that, something that was moving up from a long way down. She said, "I have 9 children, Clarence." I said, "I know. I helped put winter wheat in for 3 of them, and I've fixed most of the things that were going to kill the rest of you before spring. I know what 9 children is." She said slow, "I told myself I didn't need." I said, "I know what you told yourself." She looked at me. The hatchet was at her side, and her other hand was holding the handle of it the same way she'd held the axe on the first afternoon, and her eyes were the color of the creek in October. She said, "You're a stubborn man." I said, "Yes." She said, "You don't listen." I said, "I listen to everything. I just don't always agree." She looked down at the ground and then back up at me and said, "The farm's north of here." I said, "It is." She said, 9 children can't move in the winter." I said, "Spring, when the wheat's in." She said, "And this place?" I said, "We'll let it if we can find a tenant. The land's worth something." She said, "You've thought about all of it." I said, "I told you, November." She was quiet for a long time. I waited. I am a man who can wait. I have been farming this creek bottom for 30 years, and farming teaches you that the thing you're waiting on doesn't hurry for being watched. She said finally, "I'm not going to be," she stopped, tried again. "I'm not soft. I'm not going to pretend to be softer than I am." I said, "I know that." She said, "I'm difficult." I said, "So am I." She said, "I have opinions about things." I said, "Nora, I know." She looked at me and I looked at her, and the cold gray sky pressed down over both of us, and I thought of all the mornings I'd driven this road, and all the Saturdays at that table and Ellis bringing cornbread and the shape of the winter wheat in the south field. She set the hatchet against the woodpile. She stepped toward me 2 steps, not dramatic, just close, and put her hand flat on my chest, over my coat, and looked up at me. She said, "Yes." I put my hand over hers. That was all. We stood there in the cold yard with the woodpile and the nickel sky and the sound of the children inside. And I felt her hand under mine, and something in me that had been very quiet for a very long time went warm. I said, "Pack everything." She said, "In the spring." I said, "In the spring." She nodded. She stepped back, picked up the hatchet, and went back to the woodpile. I went and picked up the splitting maul that was leaning against the fence and stood beside her, and we split wood together in the cold morning, until Ellis and Warren came back out from wherever they'd been hiding, and we put them to work stacking. The wheat came in that April. Good yield, better than I'd expected, which is how it goes when you put good seed in good soil and wait. I stood at the edge of the south field the morning before we started cutting and looked at those rows, and thought of every October Saturday I'd spent on that land, and the two boys mixing mortar and the dark soil turning under the seed drill and Ellis carrying the cornmeal sack on that first afternoon, and I thought, this is what it is to build something. Not just soil and wheat and mortared chimneys. The whole of it. We cut the south field in 3 days, me and Ellis and Warren, with Nora bringing food out at noon, and the younger children running the edges of the field in the way children do when adults are working and the day is good, and the air smells like cut grain. The yield tallied out to 63 bushels to the acre on the best rows and 58 on the poorer ones, which was better than I'd planted for. Ellis did the figures in his primer that evening and showed his mother, and she looked at the numbers and then at me and nodded once, which from her was a considerable expression of satisfaction. Her 60% of that yield, sold at Bledsoe's and at the Ridgeline Mill, gave her enough to clear the small debt she'd been carrying since Cobb left and put something aside. She told me the exact amount in that plain way she had, not hiding it and not performing it, just naming it as information relevant to the shared understanding of their situation. I told her to keep all of it. She told me we had agreed on 60-40. I told her the Cresswell lease money was coming in and I didn't need the 40. We had a discussion about it that was, I think, the most direct argument we'd had about anything, which is saying something. We settled on her keeping 68% because we were both too stubborn to meet exactly in the middle. We got the 40 acres let to the Cresswell family, who'd come down from the territory and needed land and were glad of it, good people who put the ground to work right away. We married at the county seat on a Friday in late March, no fuss, a judge and 2 witnesses, Mabel and Ellis standing in because they were old enough, and we moved Nora and the children to the North Farm the first week of April, 3 wagon loads, the younger ones riding with the goods and Mabel and Ellis walking because they wanted to. I watched Nora come through the gate of the North Farm for the first time, looking at it, measuring it with those Creekwater eyes, the same way she'd measured everything, the chimney, the south field, the cellar, me. Measuring to understand it, not to judge it. She stood in the yard and turned around slow and looked at the barn and the kitchen door and the lower field and the ridge behind, and the 9 children spilled around her in every direction. She turned and found me and said, "The barn roof needs work." I said, "East side, I know." She said, "And the kitchen window's not seated right in the frame." I said, "I'll fix it." She said, "I can fix it." I said, "We'll fix it." She looked at me, the same stillness, the same Creekwater eyes, and then, plain and simple, without ceremony, she smiled at me. It was the first time I'd seen her smile without something behind it. No measuring, no holding back, no weight of all the things she was managing. Just a smile. Her standing there in the yard of the North Farm with the April sun on her and 9 children making noise around her, and the wheat already gold in the south field, and the whole long season of it, August dust to April light, arriving at this. I have been a farming man all my life. I know what ground feels like when it wants to grow something. I know what it means when the soil is right and the seed is right and the season is going to cooperate. I knew it then. I didn't say any of that. I got down from the wagon and we got to work unpacking. That was 31 years ago. The barn roof got fixed that summer. So did the kitchen window. We split the work the way we split everything, and what we couldn't do alone we did together, and what we couldn't do ourselves we asked Ellis and Warren and the rest for. And over the years the North Farm turned into the kind of place that a man can look at and know he made it with his own hands and with the right woman beside him. She still sends cornbread when I'm working somewhere she can't be. She still says what she thinks. She's still difficult, and I told her I was too, and we were both right. Ellis has his own land now, over near the ridge. Warren runs cattle east of the county line. The younger ones are scattered in the ways that people scatter when they grow up and the world gets large. Mabel lives 4 miles down the road and brings her own children on Sundays, which makes the yard full and loud in a way that I did not know I was waiting for all those quiet years. The North Farm looks different from when I came to it as a young man. 31 years of two people working a thing is a different kind of different from 30 years of one person working it. The irrigation runs are deeper and better positioned. The cold room is twice the size. There is a porch on the south side that I built in our third year because Nora said she wanted to watch the evening come off the ridge, and I built it in a week, and she has watched from it every clear evening since. Small things and large things, all of them accumulated, none of them standing alone. I think sometimes about the Delacroft shack and the bread and the line of children and the jaw moving. I think about what would have happened if I had not turned patience around. The Creed wells came in that next year, I heard, and changed the water situation for the better. Nora might have made it through. She was that kind of woman. She might have found another way, or the land might have turned for her, or something else I cannot predict. I do not pretend that the story ends badly without me in it, because I did not know her well enough then to know what she was capable of, and I know it better now than I knew anything at 51. What I know is this. I came back down that road, and I unloaded the wagon, and I fixed the chimney and finished the cellar and planted the wheat and drove to the county seat, and split a cord of wood with a splitting maul while she stood beside me with a hatchet. And at the end of all that she put her hand on my chest and said yes, and I became the man that was needed here, and I have been needed here every day since. That is not a small thing, that is not nothing. I'm 82 years old. This morning I sat on the porch with the coffee she made, fresh grounds, always fresh grounds, and watched the mist come off the lower field. And she came out and sat in the chair beside me and didn't say anything and didn't need to. I put my hand on hers on the arm of the chair. The wheat is in the south field again this year. Third generation of seed from that original batch I put in that first October on the Delacroft 40, passed along in the way good seed gets passed, carefully, knowing what it came from. Ellis started it. His son plants it now. That's the whole story. Everything else is just the days between.